Although the Etruscan civilization was eventually absorbed into Rome, the relationship between these two ancient groups of people was long and complex. At times, it seems the Etruscans were able to inveigle their way into the Roman nobility, even becoming kings, but at other times, they battled one another relentlessly for control over the region. The Romans were unimpressed by the Etruscan women's tendency to drink wine alongside their men, but were big fans of the Etruscan priests' divination skills. However, although we know that the Etruscans and Romans had differences as well as similarities between their two cultures, some of this information comes from texts where it's difficult to separate fact from legend. There's also an air of mystery surrounding the Etruscans because their language has never been fully deciphered and very little of their domestic dwellings, temples, and theatres has survived. What we learn about them, we mostly learn from their tombs. But luckily for us, these were absolutely enormous and often very well decorated. And they've yielded tons of grave goods. Today we're going to talk about an area north of Rome where extensive necropoli, several major towns and some ports were built by the Etruscans. These are some of the key Etruscan sites close to Rome. Pergi, Punicum, Alsium and Kravska were ports, and Veii, Caesarea and Tarquinia were prominent towns. As well as the necropoli shown here, there were many other tombs that have been found scattered around the countryside. There were also a few less important Etruscan settlements in the area. I had read a lot about the Necropolis of Banditaccia before I went there, and I had seen some photographs and videos of the tombs, but nothing really prepared me for just how extensive that site is. When you walk up from the nearby town of Sabateri, you soon see these enormous mounds rising up in the landscape. There are more than 1,000 tombs at this site in total. Just think about that for a second. And along with the nearby Necropolis of Tarquinia, also sometimes called Monterozzi, it makes up a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Only a small portion of the necropolis has been excavated, and only around 10 hectares are open to the public, but it still takes a long time to get around it. The necropolis was in use for hundreds of years, from the 9th to the 3rd centuries BCE. Its earlier tombs are these circular rock-cut and stone structures covered in earthen mounds, many with polygonal masonry, and the later tombs are rectangular. The necropolis is about a 20-minute walk from the nearby town of Savateri, which is the modern-day name for what the Etruscans called Caesarea, the Romans called Carrere, the Greeks called Agylla, and the Phoenicians called Kisari. Practically nothing built by the Etruscans remains in this town. Some sections of the original fortification walls were incorporated into the castle that was first built in the medieval period. The castle now houses the Archaeological Museum, where some Etruscan finds from the area are on display. Some temples and a theatre known from ancient texts were also located in the town through excavations. The Etruscan inhabitants of the area made their money by mining iron ore in the nearby Tolfa Hills, which was traded at the ports of Pergi and Punicum, the modern-day towns of Santa Severa and Santa Marinella. A notable group of artifacts found at the Pergi port town and dating to 500 BCE are known collectively as the Pergi tablets. These gold plates contain Phoenician and Etruscan texts dedicated to the foundation of a temple to the Phoenician goddess Astarte and her Etruscan equivalent Uni. These tablets have been helpful in gaining a little understanding into the Etruscan language and, together with other evidence, show that Pergi was an important sanctuary as well as a trading port. Excavations have revealed a pretty comprehensive sacred complex made up of a northern sanctuary with 2 temples and a smaller precinct, and a southern sanctuary with altars and chapels. Pergi was connected to Caesarea by a 12-kilometre long and 10-metre wide road. Both sanctuaries sat to the south of the Etruscan settlement, which was divided into 2 urban areas, the northernmost of which eventually became a Roman colony. A few fortification walls from the original Etruscan port town are still extant, and some sections were incorporated into the later medieval castle at the site. Let's return to the Necropolis of Banditaccia and take a look at some of the more impressive tombs there. Although no domestic dwellings from the Etruscan period have survived, scholars think that the carvings within the tombs, such as architraves and ceiling beams, were meant to imitate houses, so they give us an indication of how people lived. One of the most famous sculptures to be discovered at Banditaccia is this statue of a couple on top of a sarcophagus, now referred to as the sarcophagus of the spouses. It's made up of terracotta in an anthropoid design and was once painted. As the name suggests, the tomb of the reliefs is highly decorated with stucco reliefs and belonged to a family called Matuna. Its reliefs include Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guards the entrance to the underworld in ancient Greek mythology, a demon with a fishtail, a serpent, many objects from everyday life such as crockery, items showing the family's occupation as magistrates, helmets, and weaponry. Another fascinating tomb is called the Regolini Galassi tomb, which dates to between 650 and 600 BCE and would have belonged to a wealthy local Etruscan family. When it was excavated, it was found to contain bronze cauldrons, gold jewellery, silverware, and a chariot. Many of the finds are in the Oriental style. This style appeared during the Orientalizing period, a time in the 8th century BCE when Greek art started to take on Near Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean influences. Although not a Greek culture itself, the Etruscan civilization went through a similar transformation at that time, taking on outside influences. The Orientalizing period preceded the archaic, classical, and Hellenistic periods, which saw further changes in Etruscan art. This table gives a rough chronology of these periods. The earliest phase of the Etruscan civilization is referred to as the Villanovan period. During the Iron Age, the Villanovans lived in small huts and practiced cremation, burying their dead in iron urns. These people were descended from the Bronze Age Proto-Villanovan culture, who were thought to have branched off from the Urnfield culture in Central Europe. This has been borne out by archaeological and DNA evidence, which has accumulated more and more over the years. However, the debate surrounding the origins of the Etruscan civilization has a long history. The general consensus among scholars is that the Etruscan language was not part of the Indo-European language family, and that has been the driving force behind suggestions of a non-autochthonous origin for this culture. However, it's now thought that Etruscan was a Paleo-European language dating back to the Bronze Age or maybe even the Neolithic. It was long thought to have been a language isolate, but it's now accepted that it had a close relationship with Rhaetic that was spoken at about the same time in the Alps. Around 50 kilometers to the northwest of Banditaccia is another monumental tomb complex, the Necropolis of Tarquinia. It contains 6,000 tombs, several hundred of which have remarkable frescoes dating from the 7th century BC onwards. One of the more famous tombs in the complex is the Tomb of the Bulls. Its frescoes include erotic scenes and are stylistically similar to Ionian Greek art. I had to put stars over the phallic elements because I've seen YouTube demonetize videos with less. The frescoes depict scenes from Greek mythology adapted for an Etruscan setting, but much of it is open to interpretation. For example, scholars think that the erotic fresco could be sexual, as it looks, or it could be apotropaic, meaning to ward off evil, or it could simply be a joke. Another famous painted tomb is the Tomb of the Leopards, which is decorated with a depiction of a banquet. It shows couples, servants, musicians, and gift bearers dining outside and was probably meant to depict a funerary banquet. The necropolis was in use from the Villanovan period. These are cremation burials at the site, intermingled with the later inhumations that mostly took place in rock-cut subterranean tombs covered with tumuli. Close to the necropolis is the ancient Etruscan town of Tarquina, named after its mythical founder. It's also sometimes called Tarquina. A few scant remains of this once prominent city are situated on the La Civita plateau to the north of the modern town of Tarquinia. There are sections of the original city walls still extant, as well as the lower courses of a temple. The nearest port to Tarquinia was known as Kravska. Both Tarquinia and Kravska were eventually taken over by Rome. Another important Etruscan town close to Rome was Veii, the remains of which are in the modern-day Isola Farnese. It was one of the wealthiest cities of the Etruscan League, which was an alliance between 12 Etruscan settlements. Like a lot of historic texts talking about that period, there's quite a bit of legend mixed in with references to the League, so it's not entirely clear which towns belong to it. Excavations at Veii and close by have revealed the sanctuary of Minerva, which included a temple of Apollo and many tumuli and chamber tombs. This incredible life-sized terracotta statue was excavated in the sanctuary at Veii. Of course, there were other prominent Etruscan towns further north, but in this video I wanted to talk about those closest to Rome and show how these settlements and ports formed a rich trading network, but of which little remains. Therefore, it's in the tombs where we get a good idea of the architecture, art, and day-to-day lives of the Etruscans. That's it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.